Hi everyone, this is your host Greg. This is part 2 of the Early Career Playwright special. Part 1 basically doubled our usual download rate, so I'm happy to welcome all of you new listeners. Before we begin, I'd like to say that we are trying to make this podcast a long-term institution in the Boston theater scene. To do that, we have to make the podcast self-sustaining. Currently, we are the proud recipients of a grant from the Bob Jolly Charitable Trust, for which we are very grateful. This grant allows us to offer payment to the actors you hear on the podcast, but we would like to be able to offer the actors a larger amount that truly reflects their contributions. Another avenue where we would like to draw support is from you, the listener. We have set up a Patreon account in which listeners can pledge money for each episode of the podcast posted, as little as $1 per episode. I'd like to thank supporter Melissa Fristrom for supporting us on Patreon. If you would like to support the podcast and receive some cool rewards in return, like 10-minute sneak previews of future episodes, go to our webpage, bostonpodcastplayers.com, and click on the support page under the About Us tab. That page has a link to our Patreon and a list of other ways you can help the podcast. Some as easy as hitting like on Facebook or rating us on Apple Podcasts. We would appreciate any support you could offer. And now, on to our show.
Boston Podcast Players is supported by a grant from the Bob Jolly Charitable Trust.
Boston Podcast Players.
The story thus far.
Cast of characters.
Empress of
An
Rome.
entity or demon.
A run-of-the-mill Polish guy in his 40s. Setting.
In a small hut
A
in the
long
city of
forgotten
Beijing.
era that lives both in the
Act
past.
1,
We
Scene 1.
create the
Possible.
world with the stories we tell
Act
about
1,
ourselves.
Scene
Because
2.
Steven, he could
Act
be anywhere,
1,
right?
Scene 3.
Don't give up the ship!
Cannon fire.
Bianca pushes the stop button. The end.
Welcome back to Boston Podcast Players and the Early Career Special, Part 2. My name is Greg Lamb and I'm your host. Today I'm joined by Early Career Playwrights Jackie Martin, David Fristrom, Sharisse Zeeronian, and Jamie Wilkinson, and also by our panel of experts, Ilana Brownstein of Company 1, playwright Patrick Gabridge, and Artistic Director of Boston Playwrights Theater, Kate Snodgrass. We've heard about the burning questions of the early career playwrights, so now I've asked the expert panelists to each think of one thing that they think that early career playwrights should know or should be doing right now, but probably are not. So let us start with Kate Snodgrass.
We've sort of already talked about this in part 1. Both Ilana and Patrick spoke to it, and I think I did too in some ways, but theater is about people and making relationships between people. And I would urge all early playwrights to gravitate to that theater and to hang out there and volunteer and be there for as long as they can. Stand it. And be respectful and also responsible and let the theater know that you're someone that they can rely on. I know as an artistic director, I'm run by guilt, and I cannot stand not to pay artists. So I will let a volunteer do something, but I then, after time, and they're rigorous about it, and if they show up, and if I know, oh, they're serious, oh my God, they're serious, then I start to think, how can we fit them in? Maybe they'd like to hear their play read. Okay, I can do that for a small amount of money. And I'm much more willing to do that when I know them. So I would say it takes some time, though. Like Patrick, you hung out for 2 years with Rough and Tumble or whatever it was. But in that time, you established a rapport and a relationship. And I think that's pretty much everything in the theater. It's all about who you know and who likes you and who respects you and who trusts you. Trust being the top.
That feels really spot on because I think almost nobody, such a small percentage of people actually get paid what they're worth.
Yeah.
Right? In the theater. Almost nobody. I mean, Tony Kushner doesn't make his living from his plays.
Right.
Okay? So we're not going to. And as a result, because everybody is in some way making some sacrifice in order to do that work because they believe in it or they believe in the people they do it with, that element of trust is really huge.
Really huge.
You know, if I'm going to invest the time and emotional effort and artistic effort to connect with somebody and see if they're the right person for this opportunity, or, you know, if we can build a relationship over time, I really want to be clear that they are not an axe murderer. Or, right? Like, I really want to be clear. I also want to be clear that, like...
Ilana, it was just that one time.
I know.
Man, judgmental.
And, like, more realistically, I actually really deeply care that the person that I'm going to be investing that time with is, like, pretty self-aware.
Yeah.
Especially within the context of Company One, but certainly in any context, I care. Do you understand your privilege? Do you understand your positionality? Do you understand who you are in relationship to the world? Right? Whatever that is, wherever you sit on that spectrum, are you self-aware? And can we work together in a space that allows us to all be self-aware together? Because if we can't do that, we can't actually make the art.
Yeah.
I think just to amplify on that, I think part of what is helpful for a person trying to get involved is to consider how you can be of service. And that can be at a theater, but also can be to your community at large. Mm-hmm. And so serving at a theater in a service position is really helpful. And that's not, and what that means in service is not just in service to yourself, but in service to the institution that you're helping or to the artistic community. So, for example, like in our community, there's Stage Source, there's the New England New Play Alliance, there's the Theater Benevolent Fund. There's many ways that you can get involved serving the community that strengthen it and make it better in the human sense as well as in the more productive sense. Like the New Play Alliance, the whole goal is to make it so there are more new plays, more audiences for new plays. But the way you're doing that is in service of the greater good. When you do that and you have that as your focus, you make real relationships with people who say, oh, this is a person I can trust, who is reliable. And you can do it in a way that doesn't feel like you're trying to advance your thing, right. That you're not have a script in your back pocket, right. That instead you're looking out for everybody. When you do that, it pays off.
I so agree. I have alums on my door wanting to help me, quote, help me, but I know what they have in their head. Mm-hmm. I know that they want their play produced, and it always makes me just nervous because I'm going to let somebody down. And I totally agree about the full heart. Let's have a full and open heart. And if you like my play, then let's get together. And if not, I hate you, but let's still get together.
There are things you can do that are both self-serving and of service that help everybody, right? Like mutualism, right? Everybody gets something out of the deal. One thing that I strongly recommend is being a script reader. Yeah. I think every playwright should be a script reader. And not just at one place, but at different places, because different places will have different ways of articulating their aesthetic, different needs that they have. When I worked at the Huntington, I trained countless numbers of script readers, and I had a very strong system. There are other places that don't have systems, but you still get a training, right? And what that means is that you will read so many bad plays. So many. And you will read an enormous number of mediocre or boring plays that are not terrible. They would be more interesting if they were terrible. And then you will read a small proportion of plays that are doing something really fascinating. And you will get so good at spotting them. And as you get better at spotting them, as you read the vast numbers of plays that are just sort of boring, because that is what so many plays are. And I want to be really clear, I'm not saying playwrights write boring plays by default. I'm saying there are so many plays in the world, and so many of them haven't had any sort of spark of life in them yet, right? You will get excellent at figuring out how and why plays are boring.
That's great advice. I agree.
And then you'll make a relationship with the theater. You know, yeah. And I think over time that is of service to everybody.
And you can sign up to get a packet for Boston Theater Marathon in the fall.
That's a great place to start.
That is a perfect place to start.
Really great place to start.
So I want to ask James, speaking of projects that put you into contact with other local theaters, has a positive relationships developed from your work doing the Rabbits Review Boston.com blog?
It's actually...
Make sure to put the Boston at the end.
Yeah, be sure to put the Boston at the end so that you go to the correct site. It's been really fantastic and really, really rewarding. It's funny you mentioned script reading in college. I went to Trinity in Hartford, and I got to do script reading for Hartford Stage. And you see how much terrible stuff is out there. But then you get the one exciting one, and it's great. What's been really great about writing criticism in all of its various forms is fantastic. I do get to see shows that perhaps maybe I wouldn't have thought to necessarily pay to go see. And then you find so many pockets of really interesting work that's just not getting the attention it deserves. I saw a show last year I absolutely loved, well written, well directed, well acted, and I was literally the only one in the theater. It was me. And I think someone, like the director, like called her boyfriend and was like, "There's a critic coming, we can't like not do the show."
Oh my God.
And I went to go, and I wrote this glowing thing and sent it to them, and I was like, "Great, keep going. You gotta, so to be able to do that, it's incredibly rewarding. But I think also more to your point, you develop that spidey sense. With the more you see, the more you read, of like being able to gauge when something's working and when it's not.
More importantly, you're going to be able to gauge your own writing.
Yeah.
It's really, really important.
Being able to look at something quasi-objectively and say, okay, this section of the play isn't working. That's what I have to. And that only comes from developing those spidey senses.
Yeah. You may also find yourself, this is something that I find happens a lot more than we really talk about. You're a playwright. You might be reading plays for a theater. You read a play by somebody you've never met before, never heard of before. The play sticks with you, right? You talk about it now and again. Maybe you advocate for it at that company. They don't produce it for whatever reason. That play kind of like sits in your mental back pocket. Later down the road, you meet that playwright, or you meet somebody who knows that playwright, or you find yourself in the position to advocate for that writer in some very tangible way. That is an act of like definitive good. Right? And the more acts of definitive good we can do on behalf of other people in the community, it comes back to us, right? The more kindness and the more generosity we put out into the world, I think this stuff accrues like in the community and then to ourselves in a way that actually, for me, gives me the energy to keep going when it feels like impossible.
And that actually brings up a point around people get hung up on the notion of like networking as like it's something you should do, and I don't know what that means and stuff like that. But what it really means is do things for other people that are helpful for them, and it ends up being useful for you because it builds relationships. So I think we used to have like a little marketing binge that was a networking binge, and like one of the assignments was once a week advocate for someone's play other than your own. Send out a letter, an email to some theater or somebody you know, say you should read this play. And it kind of puts good karma into the world. But I also tell you, there's nothing that will make someone like you better than you telling somebody else good things about their play.
There's so I want to share two quotes that I think lift that up and like shake it around a little bit, which I love, which is, so Nan Barnett, who is the executive director of the National New Play Network, she always says, it's the networking part of the network that makes the network work. Right? So that it's like you could be in a relationship to people, but like you're not networking because I think people sometimes feel gross about networking. Right. If you feel gross about networking, it's because you're doing it wrong. Right? Yeah. It's that relationship building, the networking that makes your networks work for you and for others. And then Julie Henricus, the former executive director of Stage Source, she always talked about the 80-20 rule. Like if you're at a cocktail party, you want your conversation to be 80% about other people's stuff and amplifying other people, and 20% about whatever you're doing. And I think if you practice that on social media, and if you practice that as an artist, really like putting yourself out there for 80% for other people and 20% for yourself, it also does that thing that brings it back to you.
I want to talk to Patrick because a lot of your projects recently seem to have been fruitions of some of these long relationships that have been fostered over the years, right?
Yeah, that is true. And a lot of it is, you know people and you interact with them, you go see shows and you talk to them. So I tell a story about how I had a show. A thing that has helped me start doing a whole bunch of site-specific plays is because I was having coffee at Flower with Nora Long, who was going to tell me she wasn't going to do my play at the Lyric, which was fine. But I happened to see Sarah, the managing director at that moment. She just like passed me by and said, "Hey, Pat, how you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, good, and whatever." But she got a call the next week from someone looking for someone who wrote historical plays, and they're doing something in a museum. And she's like, "Oh," I was on her mind because she had just seen me. I was out in the world with people. And not even to get good news, like it was to get bad news. But that wasn't the point. The point was I was there, I was seen, I knew her, but we weren't like friends. We were just colleagues, but I was on her mind because I was visible. And part of that is be visible, be in the community, then people can remember you to do something for you because you put something else out into the world.
Best advice. Best. Yeah.
So should we go on to a next big thing? Ilana, would you like to?
Oh, sure. I'm trying to figure out how to synthesize all these little things into one big thing. But I think Okay, I think if I were to put all of these into one bucket, my one bucket is, please, for the love of whatever you believe in, please write a world that looks as rich as the world that we live in. Please do not continue to write, not that you do this personally, but the world I'm speaking to, please do not continue to write plays that are all white, all middle class, all cis. The world is so much more interesting and complex and rich. And if you're a writer who feels uncertain about how to create characters that have experiences different from your own, then my hot tip for you as an artist is enrich your own world, right? If you feel like you can't write trans characters, maybe you don't have enough trans people in your life, right? Or maybe you don't have enough familiarity with the humanity that other people experience. And that sounds a little bit like a slam. It's really not. But I do think that sometimes people take that advice of write what you know too literally and as too small a container. I think write what we know, but know a lot. Be an artist who knows the world, and then the world can live on your stage. And I think the more writers who are pushing themselves to the spaces of discomfort, where you inevitably will make mistakes. We all make mistakes. That's okay. That's what development is for. But if you can take the risk and begin to write a much more rich and complex stage life that's more like the world around us. I think about Chuck Mee a lot, Charles Mee, who said, my plays really do not live in the world of all straight, white, able-bodied people. And, the world isn't like that. And my plays shouldn't be like that. So please don't cast them like that. As writers, I think you have a lot of control over your work through how you structure your casting descriptions, how you structure your author's notes, how you think about the complexity of the stage picture that you're painting. And I encourage writers to take ownership of that and to make a stand for a better world.
That's awesome. And going off of that, I don't want to veer off topic too much, but this is something, I think that's awesome advice, but is it problematic too? Maybe it's something I do a lot, maybe I shouldn't. Sometimes I write characters where they can be played by anybody, regardless of race. Is that a problem in any way, or regardless of sexuality? Like, is it a problem where I'm not saying that we shouldn't have, but I'm saying, like, what if they could be played by anyone and it wouldn't?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
I think that is one of the most pressing questions people encounter. So I'll tell you what my personal take is, and other people have different ideas. My personal take is, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with writing characters that are neutral, perceived as neutral, right? Whatever that means. But I want to challenge what the default is, because the realities of casting and producing in this country are that people will always cast and produce white, able-bodied, cis, unless told otherwise. And so if you put an author's note that says, these characters could be anybody, there's nothing that is actually asking a casting director to think more broadly than they might otherwise do. Plays and playwrights that are specific about what they're looking for, those specific requirements have to be met in order for the play to be produced, right? So if you put in your script, like, this character could be played by a white able-bodied person, or this other series of qualities, right, or identities, people are actually really mostly going to cast the person who comes into the room, who most often is going to be a white able-bodied person, right? So if you care about how that stage picture looks, I invite playwrights to be much more specific. I also want to challenge the idea of, like, this could be played by anybody. Well, okay, but what is that neutral? Like, what is actually the definition underneath that neutrality? That colorblind or gender blind or sexuality blind, or, right? Like, that notion of, like, that there is a way to be colorblind, or, right? I would invite us to think about instead of being, this term colorblind, instead of that, I would say color conscious, gender conscious, right? How can you emphasize the world of the play you're trying to create by making specific invitations in your casting lists? If you want a really good example of this, if you look at the cast list for An Octoroon by Brandon Jacobs Jenkins, it is a litany of, like, very imaginative and politically specific casting requirements, where it will say, like, this person should be played by somebody who is mixed race, or if not that, somebody who is, and then it lists like 6 options. At the very end is like white passing, right? Like, so I think if you can get hyper specific about what you're trying to say in your play and put those invitations in your cast list, I think that is, I see that as an imperative to the people who are doing the casting.
We do live in America, and race is a big deal here.
Yep.
We put an Asian person on stage, you put any person of color on stage, it's going to have repercussions. And you have no control over that. Or maybe you want control. You know, I prefer to have the control from my little desk, you know, so that I know that something in Chicago is going to be played how I want it to be played. If you don't care, you know, I agree. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just that you have more power if you choose, if you know in your head what you really, really want. And then it has repercussions on the play.
I also think I think sometimes I will say, I encounter plays a lot and playwrights who are wrestling with this question. And perhaps the playwright might say something to me like, well, I want to have a diverse cast on stage, but these characters aren't dealing with issues of identity. And my response is, characters don't have to deal with their identity to be on stage, right? Like, you can have a character of any race, class, background, sexuality, just like living their life, do you know? And I think that if
and
you
the
can,
audience will do what we want with it.
Yeah,
So,
that's right. And so you have to be mindful and specific about the world you're creating. But I also, this other piece is like challenge the idea that, for example, a Black person on stage has to be dealing with their Blackness in a kind of like very specific way. They can simply be living their life.
Right. I get that with my plays more
Right.
than once, where I'll be like, no, I wrote a multiracial family because I want a multiracial family, because I have a multiracial family and I'd like to see that family on stage. And you don't get to say, well, they do say, why is this character have to be Black? I mean, because I said so.
Because they are.
Because I said so.
That's the life.
And it's my play. And I love the challenge that you're putting out there. I do think at the same time that we challenge ourselves to say this is important for the world and encourage people to take that. And it also depends on your style too. Like there's certain styles where you can say, well, maybe it doesn't matter. I don't know. But I think you have to be realistic as a writer to understand that there is an impact on your ability to get that play produced. I definitely feel it in my work. It has to do with what theaters perceive as their casting pools and what choices they're making. So I think people should do it. At the same time, they have to be realistic and say it's going to have an impact. But I think it's important to choose that consciously, to say I choose to face the world and make this important to me. And this is the world that matters. But don't do it blindly.
I know, Jackie, when I saw your play at Slam Boston, it was a mother-daughter play, and the cast was 2 African Americans. I don't know what the script was, though. What is it?
It wasn't actually specified in the script. I may have had a note in that.
They're living their lives.
Yeah, it could have. There may have been a note. I don't remember if it had a note that it could be 2 women of any background or ethnicity. I don't know if I did. But
an open theater for that event was specifically saying, this
that's
is diversity.
I mean, again, it's a 10-minute play, so you're just really looking at one short moment, and I felt like it was about a pretty relatable, universal sort of dynamic. And I actually just saw that done again recently with 2 women who were white in it as well. So it was interesting to see that 2 different performances. So no, I didn't have it specifically in there, but I'm like already my wheels are kind of turning in my head about, all right, what can I go back to? Because I don't often specify. So what can I go back to and actually say, all right, well, let me give this character a specific identity that maybe doesn't get put on stage all that much, to give more people opportunities to play them if it gets produced.
I really appreciate you saying that, Patrick, because I think it can feel dangerous when playwriting can feel so much like a struggle against the odds no matter what. I think it can feel dangerous to make choices that seem as though they're going to discount your work from certain production opportunities, which is why I think a lot of folks go with these could be played by anybody, because it seems like that would be a way to make it more applicable to more different kinds of theaters, more people, more casting pools. And I think that's true. Simultaneously, I think there's a way in which I think playwrights can be driven by personal mission and use artwork to create the world you want to see, right? Be the change we want to see in the world. And anytime you get specific about anything, whether that's your subject matter, your theme, your casting, your form, any of that, the more specific you are, the more other people will be like, that's not for me. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing.
Right.
I think the more specific you are, actually the easier it is for you to find your people and to say, oh, those other places, those are not my places. Do you know?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Yeah. In a way, it's not limiting. In the odds, it is limiting. But in the specificity, you're finding the right place quicker for your play. And that's smart.
I also want to put a plug in. If you're going to write beyond your own experience, whatever that means. You know, like that could mean a million things. If you are going to write beyond your own experience and you feel uncertain about the authority you have to write that or the information that you need in order to write that authentically, hire somebody to work with you. Like you're going to write a character of color and that's not your experience, hire a dramaturg of color. They're out there, right? Hire a trans dramaturg. Hire somebody who, and don't ask people to do that work for free, right? Like never ask people to do that work for free, especially if you're asking them to educate you about their own lived experience. But it's a great opportunity to pay a professional who's willing to do that. They'll let you know if they're willing to do that, right? And then you have a collaborator, you know? So that's my hot tip.
And one thing is that new play exchange, when you put your plays up there, as you, of course, you're going to, the new feature they have is that you can list all the characters in your plays, and then they have you check off which boxes they are in terms of ethnicity, age,
gender expression,
all that. So now you're sort of forced to choose, all right, played by anybody, or, you know, it has to be a female, this one, or this one has to be this and that.
And even more interesting,
it just puts it in your mind what you've chosen.
NPX has actually gotten even more granular than that. You are asked to differentiate, or to select choices for both the character and the performer, right? Because your play can specify this is a female character played by a trans performer, or this is a gender non-binary performer that's going to play a male character and a female character and a non-binary character, whatever that is, right? If your play operates in sort of the complexity of that realm, sort of that frisson between the identity of the performer and the identity of the character, you can actually make that specific thing on NPX, which is amazing.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I have 10 plays. How many characters? I have to go back and redo all this.
It does take a little time.
Oh, man.
And your catalog is deeper than mine. So. All right. So why don't we get to Patrick? Have you thought of a big thing to impart?
My hot tip. I think the key watchword for me to people starting out, regardless of age, is patience. This is a long game, and it's often incredibly discouraging at times. And the hard thing is that you are not very good when you begin. If you're doing this and you've had a little bit of luck, you've had maybe one good thing you've written. And then you'll have a bunch of stuff you write that's not very good. And for a reason, because you're not very experienced at it. And it takes a long time to get good at this. A really long time. So I think you have to find ways to keep getting that positive reinforcement, which I think is a big plus for writing 10-minute plays, in that they're easier to write than long plays in general, and it's easier to get them produced and get someone telling you, yeah, you're a playwright. That's a good thing. But to understand, and that you're going to get some full-length plays produced, hopefully, and even those, you're not very good at it yet because it's your first one, and then your second one, and your third one. And you might be a genius, but let's say there's not there are many of them. But there are a lot of people who grow into becoming good playwrights. But it takes time and a lot of practice. And so if this is something you can't help but do, which I think is probably the only reason for doing it, because you're not going to get rich and really not famous. You have to be patient with yourself and with the world and say, I'm willing to wait it out, and I'm willing to practice to get better at it and understand that it's okay if I'm not brilliant now. I may feel brilliant, but then I'll realize years later, like, oh, that wasn't so great. Be patient with yourself. Give yourself a chance.
So this patience has a little bit, a percentage of persistence.
Yes. Yeah. Persistence is definitely required.
That's real.
I'm just let's
I feel like the silence.
Sorry.
Speaking as someone who's had its first short play produced for 2002 by Company 1 for the Boston Theater Marathon, bringing it all full circle. 2002 first full-length play produced anywhere, 2018. So that's
There you go.
So I'm going to put you on the spot for a second, Greg, because I think your path is like a really amazing one. And I think embodies so much of the conversation we've been having over the 2 parts of this podcast, that your commitment to patience and persistence, even in the face of feeling like, oh man, why do I do this? I remember sitting with you in the Play Lab program and having you say, oh, I don't know why I do this. It's so depressing. I feel like I don't get anywhere. Who are my people? And it's like all these questions that are coming up right now, and you persevered. And, I think sometimes it's about having grit and like just deciding you care about it more than you care about other stuff. So you just keep going. But when I look at you now, hosting a podcast, bringing people together who are early career folks and people who are producers and people who've been doing it for a little while longer, as a way to kind of spread information. Like this is the networking stuff. This is the generosity stuff. This is amplifying other people's work. Like this, I don't know. I'm really so grateful for you and to have you as part of the Boston theater scene, because I think, even in the spaces where you have been feeling so defeated by the business of playwriting, you have come back through that defeat to a space where you've made like really amazing contributions. And
Talk about an open heart.
Yeah.
And, doing good for the community. That's exactly what you're doing. So thanks.
Thanks. Well, thank you. I remember that day. It was, a rough day. I was fighting back tears while saying all that and just saying, what am I doing? I'm just trying with this here to just put in place like information I wish I had in 2003, 2004, just, trying to get some sort of map that people can follow. Because there is no map right now.
Well, and actually the odd thing is that there is no map.
Yeah.
Like it's not that we've been hiding something from you and that there's really a secret pathway. There really is no secret path. It's different for everybody. And for me, I would say what's helped me a lot in the last few years is actually accepting that my path is not the path that I imagined, which is kind of foisted on us by like reading American Theater Magazine too much and like, oh, I need to be in this Lort Theater and this program and all that stuff. And then I realized that, I'm getting my work done and making my own way in a way that's really specific to me and not wanting some of the typical thing that I wanted. Not caring about that, like it'd still be great if it happens, but that's not important to me anymore. It has freed me up and let my actual work be much more fruitful, and I'm actually a much happier human being because of that.
It's funny, I think sometimes about how when baby actors are just getting their feet under them and they all dream of Broadway, right? Like, I'm gonna be on Broadway, I'm gonna be in a movie, right? And for the most part,
that voice,
that's
too.
right, exactly.
It is.
Most actors do most of their work. Most actors in this country do most of their work not at those incredibly rarefied echelons of the practice, right? Which I think it can feel like is, when you're reading American theater or when you're following the New York Times or whatever, you're like, oh, I wish that were me. And I think the same is true for playwrights. The majority of the work that playwrights do in this country is not at Lort theaters.
Karen Zacharias, one of our alums, is one of the most produced playwrights in America right now, and she's never been in New York.
Yeah.
Not produced in New York at all.
I think Karen's career trajectory is like such an amazing example.
It is of persistence, patience, and she just keeps writing and better. And she's dealing with a lot of the same issues we're talking about today.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of, let's talk about geography a bit. Let's talk about the Boston part of being a playwright in Boston. What are the particulars of the landscape of creating stuff in Boston as opposed to, let's even leave New York out of it. New York is its own thing. Just Boston versus other comparably sized cities.
So here's our biggest challenge. And it's been reported on all over the place. It's been, we have government reports on it. We have media reports on it. We lack space. And the reason we lack space is because Boston is a small city, geographically small, right? And it is highly developed. And anytime, you look at Chicago, right? The notion of storefront theater. They have storefront theater because they have empty storefronts. Right? There's like oodles of empty storefronts. Maybe not so many now as there used to be. Boston has never had that. Anytime there has been sort of a gap in development in a neighborhood, it's because people have decided they don't want to go to that neighborhood. And then once the artists come in, this is like the classic gentrification problem, right? artists come in, and it becomes at the South End, right? I was on staff at the Huntington when we built the Calderwood Pavilion, and we had subscribers who, for the first couple of years that we programmed at the Pavilion, refused to buy tickets to any show in the South End because they were afraid of the South End. Now, that's got a lot to unpack in that situation, which we don't have time really to talk about that. But, we haven't traditionally as a city had empty storefronts to turn into art spaces. And the more art spaces we have had that have been found spaces, or like the Factory Theater, long respect, RIP, the Factory Theater, spaces that are just gobbled up by developers the moment they can get their hands on them. And because of that, the strata of the producing scene in Boston has a couple of really top-heavy, large theaters, and then a kind of selection of mid-sized theaters, and a huge gap between mid-size and fringe. And there's almost no resources available for funding to anything below the solid mid-sized theaters. And I would think, I know that the mid-sized theaters also feel there's no funding available to them. And the large theaters feel there's no funding available to them because the funding goes to the symphony or to the MFA or to the other sort of like AAA, high-end, elite sort of cultural institutions. The ramification is that almost everything in Boston is done by people who are doing 6 other jobs and have no money. And the quality of work is kind of amazing. Right? But it's all sort of like hard scrabble, and the fringe it's very hard to find financial support for the fringe. And so really what I would say about what is the ecology of Boston is an ecology in which people who find success, and I use that term in all kinds of quotation marks because that means something different to everybody. We don't really mean financial success, artistic or self-fulfilled success. People who find success do it because they have found a way to self-produce. And that could mean different things. It could mean bringing a play to full production. It could mean running a reading series. It could mean whatever that is. But people who've created opportunities for themselves and invited people into those opportunities, those are the folks who I think feel the most satisfied.
The people who take action.
That's right.
Can I also just 2 points from what you just said? 2 points that popped up into my head. So first off, I was in Chicago last year and visiting a friend, and she brought me to this like theater space. It was like 3 or 4 black boxes in one building, and I just like sat there because there's nothing like this in Boston. But I'll also say, because I run one of those fringe theater companies, I do want to plug, not just because I'm sitting next to her, the Black Box Fellowship that BPT does.
Yes. Absolutely.
Where companies can come in and rent a space for cheap. I mean, that's really that's been incredible for us to be able to really try to make new work a part of. So that's, thank you to Kate.
Yeah, I mean,
and making that commitment.
Your work, Kate, has been
enormous,
incredibly important for the small theater scene here and for new work here. I mean, it is universally acknowledged. I mean, the crazy thing is we could have 3 more BPT-sized spaces easily, and they'd be full all the time in here, and that's why the loss of the factory hurt us. No.
It's so frustrating.
Yeah.
I mean, even the churches, you can
do one-offs, but you can't do a run.
Double Edge used to be down the street in a little church, and they're now gone. I mean, it's very, very sad and frustrating.
I do want to put a plug in for spacefinder.org, though. Spacefinder.org is a great resource. You can go on and people have put spaces of all kinds that are available for artistic work. And it provides a listing of the rates and whether they're negotiable and contact information and some photos usually. And so, but the problem is, of course, you can't often find a space that'll let you do a multi-week run. Right. You can find spaces that you can book as one-offs.
Right. It's also just as someone who has used that resource, some postings are better run than others. Yes. So there are some where you can actually book through Spacefinder. There are others where like maybe they'll give you an email address, you send an email, and it's really just you screaming into the void.
Yeah. So the other thing to know is that the BCA has just revised their small theater contracts, and so they're going to they have a new tiered pay system, a rental system that is going to make it a lot more possible for smaller fringe companies to produce.
That's great.
And then the other thing to know is the Boston Public Library has been doing a lot of work with theater companies. And so it's worth getting on their radar and having conversations with them because there are opportunities there. Fresh Ink, for example, Company One, both companies use those spaces frequently.
Right.
And if all else fails, you can start a podcast.
That's right.
I think my take on the Boston scene that is interesting, because we've done some studies on it through the New Play Alliance, is that though we lack resources, kind of like what Ilana said, it is an incredibly vibrant new play community. We punch far above our weight for the size of our city, which is just continues to astonish me, that the number of new plays that are done here is insane, and actually the number of people who go see them, despite complaints, I will say at the mid-sized level, sometimes people say no one goes to see new works. It's actually not true. That there actually, I mean, the years that we did it, in the 2 years stretch, there was more than 250,000 people saw new work.
Right.
So they're there. And we had a discussion at a meeting we were at yesterday, and I'll say it out loud, that when mid-sized company blames a new play that it didn't succeed, the reason it didn't succeed is not because it was new. And we have to, if I could change everyone's mindset, and there are a lot of friends of mine who run those companies, it's the play was the wrong play for the audience. It wasn't the right play. Maybe it wasn't a good play. There's a lot, maybe it wasn't done well. There's a lot of reasons.
At the wrong time.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons why plays fail. Productions of plays fail, but blaming it on the newness is a mistake.
Yeah.
And that hinders our mid-level ecosystem, I will say, a little bit, because it's an accepted mindset, but I will say, and I'm biased, I'm a new player person, but I think it's a mistaken impression of how things work. But the key thing is,
it's like an old way of thinking.
It's
like
very
this
old.
is like artifacts of like the past, right?
And I have to point out, I go to an awful lot of theater. There's some that I don't get to, but I'm not sure I distinguish that much between a play I haven't seen is to me a new play.
That's right.
And so these mid-sized theaters, most of their subscribers are seeing a bunch of plays that are new to them.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the Huntington is a good example of a big company who realized that it didn't matter, and they stopped their marketing focus when they do a new play. You can't really tell. That's not the thing they show that's about it that's exciting, because they've also seen, they look at their data, and their data shows their most successful plays that have actually been new plays by women of color, to be honest.
Yeah, that's right.
Like their top 4 sellers.
Yeah.
But by not promoting it as this is new work, untried, just don't tell people. They won't know.
Yeah, there's actually like a whole bunch of studies out right now that are all about like the fact that world premiere, the term world premiere means like literally nothing to audience members. They don't know what that means.
So they don't care. But I think it's a vibrant scene, and sometimes people feel, especially if writers are struggling, they feel like, oh, there's no opportunities for me here. The thing is, that's the way in every city. If you go to Denver, you will feel the same. If you go to Atlanta, you will feel the same. Maybe not Minneapolis, because sometimes they have more money. But I would say we all struggle, and Boston's doing a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
So I want people to understand it's a good place to be.
I also think that, just as a measure of how far above our weight we punch as a city, we have 2 core member theaters for National New Play Network in the direct Boston area. Plus, we have Wellfleet Harbor, which I believe is still an NPN member, just like right outside the greater Boston area. Like that alone, and Merrimack, right? That alone, I think, is like a very good indicator of the fact that there's enough work here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it should be a flashing sign to the rest of the world. And I think that's part of the frustration I feel as part of like the New Play Alliance, is like we're trying to convince the rest of the world to pay attention to Boston. Partly because we're just filthy with playwrights. Like we just have so many talented writers in this town. It's a little crazy, which is why people feel frustrated sometimes.
Part of the mission of the podcast, I feature one a month. I could easily just program the next 5 years of interesting playwrights to talk to
easily
before even starting to worry I'm running out. But I'm sure by then we'll have more.
Yes, sorry. And one more, kind of going off of that, how to get our work into these theaters. I know it's on a lot of websites, and I've dealt with this with film stuff too. Is a lot of places will not take, or in a case with film, screen, but for a play they will not produce something that's not represented by somebody who's not unrepresented by, and they don't have an agent or they don't have something. So how do we get there? How do we get representation for ourselves? I don't know.
I'm making a big X with my hand.
Yeah, it's the wrong question. It's the wrong question. I don't have an agent, and I may never have an agent because I may not be playing in that world for a while. When you need an agent, they will come find you.
Yeah, the agents come to you.
Right. You're not going to find one. And what it means is if you're not able to access that door, for the most part, you're probably not ready for that door. And it's hard for me to say that about myself because there's a lot of doors I'd like to see open. Okay. And I'm close. But I would say they'll notice you because you've built relationships and you've opened those doors for yourself, and because they're not actually
That's not their job.
they don't open doors for you, they're negotiating contracts for you. So if you're not already making money, it's not, you don't need an agent.
Yeah, that's go ahead.
But you do need the dramatist guild because
Yes.
they will have something to do with their contracts. So you don't really need an agent until, as you said, they find you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you're a Dramatist Guild member, you can, before you sign the contract, you can run it by them to the legal department, and they'll give you it for free.
Yeah.
Cost you nothing. And the Dramatist Guild offers so much.
They're wonderful.
Because I'm the rep, and I didn't mention it yet. Thank you, Kate.
And like I said, when we were running numbers of submissions, I had 180. I think Patrick had 160 of places you can submit your work without being agented, and I avoid submission fees too, whenever I can, except for some rare cases. But if you are going to put the work in delving, you can find places to get your work considered.
Because I hear underneath your question about agents, your real question is, how do I get a theater that only takes agented submissions to read my play, right?
Yeah, it's kind of what I guess maybe it was wrong of me to start, even though I was looking at smaller stuff too, and some of them still said, and I was like,
so I want to, okay, so let's talk real deal stuff. Theaters that don't take open submissions have basically come to terms with the fact that they cannot handle open submissions. That
they don't have the staff.
They don't have the staff, and when they have taken open submissions, they have not been able to treat the playwrights with the amount of care and respect and grace that they feel the playwrights deserve, right? And so that's actually there's been a huge movement nationally for literary departments to stop taking open submissions, because amongst the conversations of professional dramaturgs in the country was a long-standing debate around, like, are we just perpetuating a lie, right? If a company says we take open submissions, but then you don't actually do anything with those plays, right? As you were saying, they sit on a slush pile, right? For years, where somebody reads them and like rates them, but then nobody ever responds to the playwright because nobody wants to be the one to say no. That's really a lie, because you're saying to the playwright, go ahead, send your stuff. We're gonna look at it. But if they feel they can't, it is the more responsible choice to close that window. There are places that have modified their submission policies to find a way to make accessible their system for playwrights without kind of like opening the floodgates. Because what Patrick was saying earlier, there are people who submit everywhere without having any information about what that theater takes. And suddenly a theater that says, okay, we're gonna take open submissions for this kind of thing, suddenly you're inundated with works that are not appropriate for you. The playwright doesn't do any work to kind of figure out, like, does that play match that theater? And then the theater has like so many labor hours to sort through everything before they can even begin to find the thing that suits them. So that's the background of why these submission windows are closed. Now, I want to holler at Fresh Ink, because Fresh Ink does a really amazing thing and a huge service to local writers. They only develop and produce plays by Boston writers. And they make it equitable by saying, we open our submission window until we get 40 plays. And when we get 40 submissions, we close the window, because we know that we are able ethically and responsibly to really carefully deal with 40 plays that are submitted. And after that, you wait till next year. You didn't get it in? Okay, no problem. You just wait again till next year. Yeah. They're not the only one that does stuff like this.
Their window was open last weekend. I submitted mine at 12:15 a.m. on Sunday morning. Yeah. And they were full by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she said. So
put on.
But the first year they did that, it took a lot longer to get full. Yeah. And now people know about it. Mm-hmm. But I think in some ways, this question of like, how do I get my work seen by places that don't have an open window, a pathway in some ways it gets back to what Kate was talking about, which is relationship building. Mm-hmm. And that's the long game that Patrick was saying.
Well, two quick things though on that. One, this argues for putting your work up on NPX.
Yes.
Because like we had a Facebook talk with an agent a little while ago, and she said, now when she hears about somebody through the grapevine, the first place she goes is not to Google for their website. She goes to NPX to see if I see that script.
As a producer, I go there first, and if I can't find like a profile that tells me something about that writer and like has some kind of statement from the writer about what they do, I'm like, all right.
Well, and that's the thing, like be findable, but findable on NPX especially right now, because you don't get a second chance. Like I'm the same way. If I'm producing something, I will look. Say it's for an actor or something. I will look And if I don't find them, I'll look for somebody else because you only get so many options. And then I think look local first. Like you need to be, as a writer, whether it's filmmaker or theater producer, I think you need to be able to have some success locally in working before you can move out of this area. And the nice thing is like the Huntington program is open. Like it's every other year a lot of times, but and submitting to that program is not just saying, I'm going to get it. No, it's being read by them.
That's right. That's it.
So they remember, because they're going to put a cohort together. And I tell people this all the time, like, don't be discouraged because you don't get in the first time or the third time or the fifth time. They're balancing things, but you're getting them to know your work. And, they may like it and recommend it somewhere else. You get to know them. So there's a lot, there actually are doors that are open here, even though it feels like a lot of them are closed. They're open because you're local. And there are just ways that you can meet people through state source events is a really good one.
That cohort thing is so important. There are a lot of writers groups that feel like maybe you didn't get in for like the second or third time. But honestly, it's really about trying to balance personalities, which is a hard thing to know from the outside. But then there are things like Company One offers a thing called boot camp in the fall, which is a couple days of high intensity training programs in all kinds of things: budgeting, how to cast something, how to stage something, writing techniques, how to be a collaborator, right? And those things are offered for very, very, very low rates to make sure they're really accessible to everybody. But that's a way to get in and actually make community with folks with a very small time commitment that can begin to set you up for some relationships that will yield this access.
But I love the short time commitment on that. Yeah. That you don't have to commit to an MFA for 3 years. Like, I can go for a weekend. Yeah. Some people, that's all they can fit in their lives.
Yeah.
And that's good.
And now, because we're talking about resources in Boston and deadlines and things that are opportunities here, I prepared the sheet that I wish was available all this time of basically every deadline, resource, writers group, whatever that a Boston playwright should know. And I will make it available on the Boston Podcast Players website going forward.
Yeah. See, once again, Greg, doing for the community.
That's amazing. Wonderful. Thank you.
I want to ask about maybe some big decisions some person might make at an early career stage and what you guys think of that. So someone who maybe is just out of college and is looking around to wonder what to do next. And I have 3 things I've written down to wonder about. Should I do an MFA? Should I self-produce, start a company like James? Or should I move to a different city?
Don't move.
Don't move.
Don't move.
The other 2.
And self-produce, you don't have to start a company to self-produce.
Yes.
Right. Don't start a company.
Please don't start any more companies.
Sorry, James.
It's already it's okay. So you just got your grandfathered in.
Yeah.
Don't start a company. You don't need the headache. Like you don't need to be a nonprofit. You're not getting a grant from the Bar Foundation, right? You don't need it. You do need to create a space. Create opportunities for self-producing, but you don't need to officially be a nonprofit because, man, do you not need to worry about boards or the ratio of your income. But this thing like, what was it? Should I do an MFA?
Should I do MFA?
Yeah.
Should I self-produce? Should I move?
So please don't move. The heat loss of like how many people leave this city after getting trained here is just devastating. And it's so much better now than it was. We retain so many more folks.
But even so.
But I maybe can I throw a 4th option on there? Learn to write grants. Learn to write grants or learn to do digital marketing. If you can do either one of those things, you are going to be employable in the city of Boston in the nonprofit sector until the end of your days. And you can do that work while you are also doing your theater work. Often you can do that work at the same company you wish would produce your theater. Yeah. If you take even a half a minute to look at hiredculture.org, which is the main website for nonprofit jobs and sort of culture-related jobs in Massachusetts, I feel like every second or third post is seeking somebody to work in development, financial development at a company of some kind. And I swear to God, if you can develop that skill set, you're going to be one of the most valuable people in the Boston theater scene. And then you can hire yourself out, make money while you do your self-producing.
I think the reason to take it, to be in an MFA program is simply because it forces you to write on a regular, rigorous basis.
Yeah.
And we give you deadlines, and you also read a lot of plays. So it just inundates you with information, plus requires you to write out of your comfort zone, because nobody wants to write that fast, but we do. And it's a real learning ground. So if you feel like that's for you, and we produce you at the end of it, so that's the good news there, is that that's where playwrights really learn their job, is in production. And I guess we should all stress that, because we're sitting here in a room, and yes, we can write and do readings and blah, 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 but the goal is that production, and there's nothing like it for the playwright. It's once you see it in front of that audience, like Ilana was saying, it changes everything. So that's the goal there, and I would urge you to, if you're going to take an MFA, make sure they produce you. But otherwise, it forces you to learn your craft and to practice, and that's a good thing.
I think, because I saw your online questions, the people submitted questions, people are like, well, what can I do if I'm older, or my life won't accommodate an MFA, is it over for me? And the answer is no. It's not required that you get an MFA. I think it can be super great for a lot of people, but it's not like you're doomed if you're not in a program.
No, not at all.
Our field still has lots of room for it. I think sometimes it feels like you have to have one, but I think that's not really true. And I think it also doesn't matter how old you are, and it doesn't matter if you live in town.
Right. There are plenty of low residency MFA programs. I'm just putting that out there,
right,
so that if you do want those deadlines and people responding to your work on a regular basis, low residency is the answer, because that's exactly what it does. You don't have to move. You go for 8 days to another place in the United States or down the street, and then you come back and you write. So that's also a possibility. You're right. It doesn't matter the age anymore.
Yeah, one program that I just added that sheet's not on the printed copies is the Leslie University has a MFA writing for stage and screen, which is low residency.
But the thing you have to figure out if you're going to do it is, how do you get better? So how are you going to practice?
Yeah.
And so an MFA forces you to practice. Do you have the discipline outside of that to make yourself better? And does self-producing sometimes allows you to do that? And again, like what Kate said, ultimately, the playwrights who get really good at it are people who are experiencing their work in front of audiences a lot. Because then you understand. It's one thing to just write it, but we're not writing literature. We're writing plays that are produced. And until you understand that give and take between script, actors, and audience inherently, like you've done it long enough that you get it. And I would argue that you can't get it without experiencing it a bunch of times. So you have to figure out how that happens with MFA or self-producing or getting lucky through whatever, a lot of 10-minute plays. But that interchange, you have to witness that a lot on your own.
I think one of the best things about self-producing is that it forces you to figure stuff out that you never considered when you were writing.
Right.
Which is a great benefit. And that doesn't...
In fact, I did it all the time.
Exactly. And I'm a huge proponent of playwrights writing impossible plays. I think the more impossible a play it is, like the more unrealistic or impossible a stage direction is, the more interested I am in it. Because the theater can accomplish things that cannot be accomplished in any other way. You can do something with like a flashlight and a block that is innovative and imaginative and embodies something that if you read it on the page, you'd be like, oh, I don't know how to do that. I don't have the money for that. That looks like something on film. But if you can imagine it on stage, you can solve the problem of it, right? Especially if you're self-producing. But I also think, however you do this, whether you do it by simply throwing yourself into the fire of self-producing or whether you do it in some more systematic way, learn how theater budgets work, talk to designers about how their process works, talk to production managers about how they run a production, because those things actually have bearing on how your play comes to fruition at another theater. If you can be thoughtful about those things and informed about the world of producing, you will be a much more confident writer, because then you can write imaginatively and impossibly in ways that you yourself can think about solutions to.
Possible, right.
I recently applied for a thing at Open Theater. Their application process involves filling out a budget spreadsheet. And so you have to think about, okay, we need lighting designer, we need stage manager, we need to do this and that. Part of it, I don't have to get it perfect, because it's like they'll see it and they say, he's trying, and that's what we want to see. But it's good for them to sort of start teaching people they're going to work with. Yes, we have to think of budgets because, we're not swimming in money.
Well, as James knows from running his own company too, like I think once you've done it, because I did my first production right out of college. I'd been in New York for a year or two, and that was my big learning experience. You can have a better conversation with the producer that you're asking to do your play, Because being a producer, as Kate well knows, is the most thankless job in the world. Because there's a lot of responsibility on you. You're rarely recognized for what you accomplish. And people only know when you mess up. And if you do a good job, everybody else gets all the credit. The playwright and the director and the actors and the producers are like, oh, okay, it was merely me, but that's okay. If you can have that conversation with a producer of sympathy, like I know what you're going through when you're, especially like when I travel, like if I go, things are really going bad, and I can talk to the producer and like, I feel for you, man, I've been there. It gets you a long way because you understand what people are going through.
I will say, like, after that first production of my last play, and I started sending it out to just, anyone who I thought might be kind of interested, in the cover letter, one of the things I said is, hey, we produced this for a couple $1,000, and it was a success. Mm-hmm. Imagine what you could do. I didn't include that last part, but that was sort of the implication.
I mean, some of the best plays I've been to over the years have been fly by the seat of your pants in the basement of somebody's house using tin cans as lights. I mean, it can be so magical that if that's what it is. You don't need, as you say, you don't need 10,000, 40,000, 100,000 to do a good piece of theater.
So as Patrick
I want to add this before because we'll get off the subject, but ASP does these plays all over the place in Actors Shakespeare Project, does it in churches and in gyms and in all sorts of places. So the odd place, think in terms of that too. It doesn't have to be a theater per se. We've got to start doing that because Boston has so few theaters. Got to. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I just brought to mind that Portland, Oregon, some people had a crazy idea. Let's stage Star Trek episodes as plays in the park. Yeah. And then they did it for like 5 years.
Oh, great.
And they're like, okay, why doesn't that happen in Boston? We have parks. There's no shortage of geeks in Boston. Let me say that. Patrick mentioned that I did go on the official Playwrights page and just asked people who might have questions to be fielded in this, and most of them have been covered, really. The one that sort of he alluded to that might not have been is, what specific advice can be given to playwrights who are early career but chronologically older in age? Is there anything specific for anyone who's... Same deal.
No change.
Don't be put off.
No.
Yeah. Don't be shy, I guess, is my biggest thing. Don't be shy.
Yeah.
Turn up to stuff.
Yeah.
Show up for stuff. Throw your hat in the ring.
Go online. Do all the work. Really.
Yeah, and just be comfortable being the oldest person in the room.
Yeah.
Because it happens to all of us eventually.
Yeah.
Is that you start out and you're the young kid on the street.
I used to be young.
I used to always be the youngest person in the room, and now I'm always the oldest person in the room where I work. It's because I'm working with young theater artists on the edge, a lot of the time. And that's
in my
fine.
group are
they don't care.
Older, and one of them's a 70-year-old retiree, and she recently, last year, won a contest where she was named, our pick for emerging playwright.
I think having a young frame of mind, and by what I mean by that is having a frame of mind that is hungry and curious and innovative, right? And I think oftentimes people might perceive older playwrights as being more set in their ways.
Yeah.
So perhaps older playwrights may have a little bit of a small hurdle of just simply conveying that they're still up for the exploration.
Right.
Because I think
and
any artist,
hearing the feedback.
That's right. Any artist, I think, no matter who they are and what age they are and where they come from, folks want to work with artists who are up for the exploration.
Right.
So we should start bringing this to a close. But before I do, I want to say, is there any last thing that came to mind from anyone who wants to have it discussed before we close? No?
I have one question, maybe too big a question at the end. We've sort of been talking about it from the point of view of the playwrights, the producers, the theaters, not really getting to the audience. Who do you think is the audience who wants to see the new plays?
So many people, so many different kinds of people. I would hesitate to qualify them in a certain kind of a way.
I think there's not an answer for that. Because I think of this museum work that I'm doing. Those are people, if I'm doing a short play at the Old State House, those people aren't even there to see a play. They're on the Freedom Trail, but they're seeing a play because it's there and they want to sit down for 25 minutes. And then they end up having this experience. And a lot of the stuff people are doing in non-traditional spaces are a way of reaching what we call non-traditional audiences. But so there's not one answer. And I think that's when theaters get into trouble sometimes, is when they think, oh, I need to appeal to all this big audience. And there is no all this big audience. There's a thing for that play or this mission. Like Company One's really successful in being very mission focused in all the plays that they produce. And so they're finding the people who are interested in around that mission. And that spreads out because they do good work and people talk about it. But you got to spotlight first, right?
You got to find that audience for that play, and I think that's good advice for all of us playwrights, because there's a place for us out here. We find our voice, and my voice is different than yours, or yours, or yours, and so once that theater discovers that, audiences, that's all. You know what I mean.
Yeah, I think it is most important for a playwright to think about what audience they are speaking to, rather than think about what is the audience for new plays generically.
Yeah. Right. And the theater, too. Yeah. Who is my audience for this play? That's right.
All right. So, everyone, I think that's what we have for our Early Career Playwright special. Thank you so much to our Early Career Playwrights. I will put up whatever contact information they wish to have on our website, bostonpodcastplayers.com. And very special thanks to Ilana, Kate, and Patrick for your expertise and insight in sharing what you know. And thanks to everyone listening. Everyone, support new plays and support local playwrights.
This was part 2 of the Early Career Playwrights special with David Fristrom, Jackie Martin, James Wilkinson, and Sharisse Zeeronian. You can find David, Jackie, and James on New Play Exchange. David's site is davidfristromplaywright.com, and James's site is rabbitreviewsboston.com. Follow us on Twitter at BossPodPlay and on Facebook. Please rate us on iTunes or your podcast player of choice. You can support us on Patreon at BossPodPlay. Our theme was composed by Thomas Deas, thomasdeasmusic.com. Additional music by bensound.com. Other than yourself, do you know of a Boston area playwright who you'd like to be featured on the show? Let us know at bosspodplay@gmail.com.